They told my son I was just his divorced mother with nothing left to offer. Brianna said it standing in my own kitchen, holding a mug I'd bought in Savannah the year Marcus, and I still believed we'd grow old on that porch together. And she said it the way you'd mention the weatherlight, certain, already moving on to the next thought. I'm just saying, Jordan, at some point she has to build her own life, she can't keep circling ours. I was not supposed to be in the room. I understand that now. I had come back in for my reading glasses, left on the counter beside the fruit bowl, and I stood in the hallway doorway, where the shadow falls just right, and I heard my son's new wife explain me to my son as though I were a line item in a budget that had stopped making sense. Jordan didn't correct her. That was the part that entered my chest like a blade turned sideways, not her words, which I could dismiss as the carelessness of a 28-year-old who had never buried a marriage or built one back up from the studs. It was my son's silence. 26 years I raised that boy alone after the divorce, drove him to debate practice at 5 in the morning before my shift at the hospital, sat in church pews explaining to Deacon Willis why his father wasn't there, and in this moment, standing 3 feet from the woman who called me nothing, my son found the ceiling fan very interesting. She just means, he started, and stopped. I know what she means, I said. They both turned. Brianna's face did the thing young faces do when they've been caught holding a knife. They didn't think anyone could see a flicker, gone almost as fast as it arrived, replaced by the practiced smoothness of someone who has never once had to apologize and win at the same time. Ms. Deborah, I didn't mean it like, you meant it exactly like that, I said. That's what makes it useful information. I did not raise my voice. I want that understood, because if you are the kind of person who has watched women like me be reduced to a single flattening word, emotional, dramatic, bitter, you already know the mechanism. You already know that the moment I raise my voice, I become the thing they need me to be in order to stop listening. So I did not give them that. I picked up my glasses from beside the fruit bowl, folded them once, and placed them in my coat pocket, and I looked at my son the way I used to look at him when he was 7 and had told a lie so small and so unnecessary I almost laughed, except this lie was neither small nor was there anything in me that wanted to laugh. Divorced, I repeated, testing the word the way you'd test a stair you didn't build. With nothing left to offer. Brianna opened her mouth. I raised one hand, not sharply, just enough, and she closed it. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're listening from today. Some of you know exactly this kitchen, exactly this silence, exactly this son, who has learned to let someone else speak for him, because it is easier than remembering who fed him. I had driven 40 minutes that Sunday to bring a pot of oxtail stew, the recipe Jordan's grandmother gave me the week before she died, because Jordan had mentioned 3 weeks ago, on the phone, in the particular voice he uses when he wants something without asking for it directly, that Brianna had been curious about family recipes. I had spent Saturday afternoon at the stove. I had packed the pot in a towel so it would stay warm for the drive. And I stood now in the kitchen, where that stew sat cooling on the stove, uneaten, while my son's wife catalogued what I no longer had to offer him. I should go, I said. Mom, don't. Jordan finally found his voice, now that the moment for using it had already closed. She didn't mean, you keep saying that. I'd be curious to hear what she did mean, since apparently you know her mind better than she does. Silence has a texture when you've lived inside it as long as I have. This particular silence was thick, humiliated, and entirely theirs. I let it sit there between the 3 of us like a 4th person nobody had invited. I'll take my pot, I said, and moved toward the stove. You don't have to, Brianna started. I know I don't have to, I said, lifting the lid, watching the steam rise one last time in that kitchen. I'm choosing to. I want you to understand something about me before this story goes any further, because titles like the one that brought you here can make a woman sound like a victim standing frozen in a doorway, and I have never in 52 years been that woman for longer than it takes to gather myself. I am Deborah Renee Whitfield. I was a head labor and delivery nurse at Grady Memorial for 19 years before I stepped down to part-time 3 years ago. Not because I couldn't do the job, but because I had spent 3 decades holding other women's hands through the most violent, sacred hour of their lives, and I had started to wonder, somewhere around my 50th birthday, who had ever held mine. My marriage to Marcus ended 9 years ago, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in the way a foundation cracks slowly, quietly, until one day you realize the whole house has been leaning for years and everyone pretended not to notice. I do not carry that divorce like a wound. I carry it like a lesson I paid an enormous tuition for, and I had believed, foolishly perhaps, that raising my son inside that lesson, showing him what dignity costs, and what it's worth, had actually taught him something. Standing in that kitchen with the pot in my hands, I learned it hadn't. Or rather, I learned that what he'd absorbed instead was that his mother's dignity was a resource to be managed, quietly. The way you manage an aging appliance you're grateful still works, but don't expect much from anymore. I carried the pot to my car. Jordan followed me out onto the driveway, hands in his pockets, the porch light catching the grey that had started at his temples this past year. My son, 28 years old and already going grey, the way his father had. Mom. She's stressed about the wedding planning still, the seating chart thing with her mother. She doesn't mean, Jordan. I set the pot on the passenger seat, closed the door with more care than I felt, and turned to face him fully. I need you to hear this once, clearly, so we don't have to revisit it. I am not a line in your household budget. I am not a resource you allocate, or a burden you manage. I raised you by myself, on a nurse's salary, in a 2-bedroom apartment on Cascade Road. And I did not do that so I could stand in your kitchen 30 years later and be told what I no longer have to offer. That's not what I heard exactly what she said. The question that matters isn't what she said, the question is what you did while she said it. I opened my car door. And you already answered that question, baby, you answered it with the fan. I drove home that night on 285 with the windows cracked, cold October air moving through the car, the stew going cold in its pot beside me, untouched, and I did not cry. I want to be honest with you about that, because I know what this kind of story usually promises: the tears in the car, the mascara running, the collapse before the rise. That is not what happened. What happened instead was quieter and, I would learn in the weeks that followed, far more dangerous to the people who had underestimated me. Somewhere around the Cascade exit, I picked up my phone at a red light and called my sister Yvette. He let her say it, I said, when she picked up. Stood right there and let her say it. Say what? That I have nothing left to offer him. There was a pause on the line, the kind Yvette gives you when she's deciding whether to be gentle or honest, and Yvette has never once in 54 years chosen gentle over honest with me. Well, she said finally. Do you? I sat with that question longer than I expected to, longer than a red light allows, so that the man behind me had to tap his horn once before I moved forward into the dark, because the truth I hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even to myself in the mirror some mornings, was that I had spent 9 years since the divorce rebuilding a version of stability so quiet, so unremarkable, that even I had started to believe stability was the ceiling instead of the floor. I had my part-time nursing hours. I had my house paid off. I had a modest retirement account I checked twice a year, and tried not to think about too hard. I had not, in 9 years, built anything that was mine, not a business, not a dream, not a single reckless, ambitious thing that belonged to Deborah, and not to the role of mother, ex-wife, or nurse. I don't know, I told Yvette, which was the first fully honest thing I'd said all night. But I intend to find out. I did not know yet what that would look like. I did not know that within 6 weeks I would sit across from a woman named Patrice Coleman at a diner off Camp Creek Parkway, and hear about a commercial cleaning contract that would change the shape of my entire life. I did not know that Brianna's careless sentence in my kitchen would become, in time, the exact coordinates of the moment she underestimated the wrong woman. I only knew, driving home that night with a pot of cold stew and a closed fist, where my heart usually sat open, that something in me had quietly, permanently, shifted its weight from one foot to the other. I was done offering what wasn't being received. I just hadn't decided yet what I was going to build instead. I did not sleep that night. I want to tell you that I lay awake crying into a pillow, because that is the version of this story that would be easiest for you to hold, easiest to forgive me for, easiest to file away as poor woman, wounded again, but that is not what 52 years and one finished marriage teaches a woman like me. What it teaches you instead is how to lie very still in the dark, and let your mind do its quiet, merciless accounting. By 2 in the morning, I was not thinking about Brianna's face, or the ceiling fan, or the particular shade of my son's cowardice. I was thinking about numbers. 9 years since the divorce. 19 years at Grady before I stepped back to part-time. 28 years since I brought Jordan home from that same hospital. Wrapped in a blanket his grandmother crocheted. A blanket I still have folded in cedar in my closet, because some things you keep even after the people attached to them stop deserving them. 28 years of birthdays and school plays and college tuition I paid alone, because Marcus's child support checks arrived like weather, sometimes present, mostly not, and I had absorbed every gap without once making Jordan feel the absorbing. And here is the number that kept me awake longest, 50-2. Age, the number Brianna had not said out loud, but had certainly meant, standing there in my kitchen with her manicured hand wrapped around a mug I bought the summer I still believed in forever. She has to build her own life. As though 52 were an expiration stamped on the bottom of a life, rather than the exact age at which a woman finally has enough evidence to stop asking permission. I got up at 4:30, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table, my actual kitchen, in my actual house on Dello Drive, paid off in full 11 months ago. A fact I had never once mentioned to Jordan, because I did not think my son's respect for me should be contingent on my balance sheet. I opened my laptop, and, for reasons I could not fully explain to myself in the moment, I typed into the search bar, starting a small business after 50. I did not know yet that I was looking for Patrice Coleman. I did not know her name yet. Did not know that 6 weeks from that grey Sunday morning I would be sitting across a laminate table from her at a diner off Camp Creek Parkway, while she slid a folder across to me and said words that would rearrange the architecture of my entire remaining life. I only knew, at 4:30 in the morning with my coffee going cold exactly the way that oxtail stew had gone cold the night before, that I was tired of being the only person in my family who understood the difference between being needed and being valued. Before we continue, let me know what you would have done in my place, standing in that kitchen. Some of you have already lived a version of this: the daughter-in-law who speaks for your son, the family that only calls when something is required of you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because I promise you, this story is far from finished with what it has to say to people like her. My son called me 4 days later, not to apologize. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only gift I have left to give myself in this telling, but to ask whether I still had the folding chairs from his graduation party, because Brianna's mother was hosting a bridal shower for one of her sorority sisters, and needed extra seating. The white ones, Jordan said. In the garage, I think. Behind I remember which chairs, Jordan. There was a pause on his end, the particular pause of a man realizing, half a beat too late, that he had called his mother 4 days after watching his wife diminish her, and had opened not with an apology, but with a request for furniture. Mom, look, about Sunday, you want the chairs or not? Mom? I have a shift Saturday morning. I can drop them by Friday evening on my way home if that works. I kept my voice level, the same voice I used to use with young mothers in the delivery room whose contractions had turned violent and unpredictable, steady, unshaken, giving them nothing to panic against. Otherwise you'll have to come get them yourself. I'll come get them, he said, quieter now, and I understood that some small, uncomfortable part of him had heard what I hadn't said as clearly as what I had. He came Friday evening. He did not bring Brianna. He stood in my garage in the failing light, loading chairs into the back of his SUV, and for a moment, just a moment, there looked like the boy who used to help me carry groceries up the 2 flights of stairs to our old apartment on Cascade Road, before either of us had learned the vocabulary of resentment. She's not a bad person, Mom, he said finally, not looking at me, folding a chair with more care than the task required. She grew up different. Her mom and her, they don't really do the whole extended family obligation thing. It's just not how she was raised. I'm not asking her to adopt my values, Jordan. I'm asking you to defend your mother in your own kitchen. Those are different requests entirely. He set the chair down. For a long moment neither of us spoke, and the garage held that silence the way it holds everything else I've stored in there over the years, patiently, without judgment, waiting to be needed again. I didn't know what to say, he admitted finally. It happened so fast, And then it felt like if I said something, it would turn into this whole thing, and I just wanted the visit to be nice. So you chose nice over true. That's not fair. No, I agreed. It isn't, but I didn't choose the unfairness, baby. I only named it. He left with the chairs. He did not apologize not that evening, and not, as it would turn out, for a long while afterward, but something had been said between us in that garage that could not be unsaid, a small crack in the version of himself he'd built where he got to be a good son without ever once being an inconvenient one. It was Yvette who first mentioned Patrice's name to me, 3 weeks later, at her kitchen table over a plate of smothered pork chops she'd made too much of on purpose, the way she always did when she suspected I needed feeding more than I'd admit. Girl from my old job at the county, Yvette said, waving her fork. Patrice Coleman started her own commercial cleaning company maybe 6 years back. Offices, medical buildings, that kind of thing. Word is she's bidding on contracts now she can't fully staff. Could use somebody who actually knows how to run something without falling apart. I'm a nurse, Yvette, not a businesswoman. You ran a labor and delivery floor of 40 people for damn near 2 decades, Yvette said, in the flat, unimpressed tone she reserved for the moments I underestimated myself in front of her, which she had never once tolerated gracefully. You think that's not a business? You think Patrice Coleman's cleaning crews are harder to manage than a room full of doctors who think they are God at 3 in the morning? I laughed, the first real laugh I'd allowed myself since that Sunday in Jordan's kitchen, and told her I'd think about it, mostly to end the conversation, mostly because some private, unexamined part of me still believed that 52 was too late to become anything other than what I already was. But I did not forget the name. I wrote it on a sticky note and put it in the drawer where I keep things I am not yet ready to decide about, the same drawer that still holds Marcus's old watch, the one he left behind 9 years ago, and never once asked for. 2 weeks after that dinner, I called Patrice Coleman. We met at a diner off Camp Creek Parkway on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, unremarkable morning that gives no warning of the ways it will matter later. Patrice was younger than I expected, early 40s, sharp-eyed, dressed like a woman who had learned the hard way that no one takes you seriously until your blazer does the talking for you. She ordered black coffee and got straight to it in a way I found I respected immediately. Yvette says you ran a floor at Grady for almost 20 years, that true? 19. Head nurse for the last 11. You ever manage a budget? Payroll, scheduling, conflict resolution, the whole ugly middle of it. Every day for 11 years. Patrice studied me for a moment, the way I imagine I used to study a chart before deciding whether a patient's numbers told the real story, or only part of it. I've got a contract I'm about to lose, she said finally. Medical office complex over in Buckhead, 4 buildings. And I don't have the management structure to run it right. I need somebody who can walk into a room full of people cleaning bathrooms at 11 at night and get them to respect a schedule the way they'd respect a doctor's orders. I need somebody nobody's going to talk over. Something in me went very still and very alert at that phrase, nobody's going to talk over, as though Patrice had reached across the laminate table and touched, without knowing it, the exact bruise Brianna had left 3 weeks earlier in my kitchen. What would it pay? I asked, and I want you to notice, if you're the kind of person keeping track, that this was the first time in longer than I could remember that I had asked a question about my own worth in dollars rather than in gratitude. She told me. It was not, in that first conversation, a fortune, but it was a door cracked open, with light coming through it I had not expected to see again at my age. I'll need to think, I told her. Think fast, Patrice said, sliding her card across the table. I'm losing that contract by the 15th if I don't get someone in there who knows what they are doing. I drove home from that diner with her card on my passenger seat, in almost the exact spot where the pot of cold oxtail stew had sat 3 weeks before, and I understood, somewhere around the Camp Creek exit, that my life had just quietly forked into 2 paths, the one where I remained the woman my son's wife had described in my own kitchen, and the one where I found out, at 52, exactly what I still had left to offer. I had not yet told Jordan any of this. I would learn, in the weeks that followed, that this silence of mine, this simple, private decision to build something without first asking my family's permission would become, in Brianna's eyes, its own kind of unforgivable offense. Patrice called me back 9 days later, on a Thursday evening while I was folding laundry in front of the television, and asked if I could start the following Monday. I said yes before I'd fully finished the sentence in my own head. The way you sometimes commit to a decision physically before your mind catches up with the courage of it. I did not tell Jordan that first Monday. I did not tell him the second week either, or the third. I want to be honest about why, because I think honesty is the only thing I owe you in this telling. It was not spite. It was not some calculated withholding designed to punish him. It was something quieter, and I think now, more important. I had spent 28 years narrating my life to my son in a way that made him comfortable, that positioned me always as the steady, explainable, manageable presence in the background of his story, and for the first time since I was a young woman, with a newborn, and no husband worth counting on, I wanted something that belonged only to me before I let anyone else's opinion touch it. The work itself surprised me. Patrice's cleaning contract covered 4 medical office buildings in Buckhead, and within a week I understood why she'd been losing. Iffy crews were good people, mostly, but nobody had ever given them a system. Schedules overlapped. Supply orders went missing. A woman named Consula had been doing the work of 2 people for months without anyone noticing because nobody had bothered to actually watch how the floors moved. Watching, it turns out, had been my entire professional life. Watching contractions on a monitor, watching a young mother's face for the flicker that told you something was wrong before the numbers confirmed it, watching a floor of nurses to know who was drowning quietly before they said a word. I built Patrice a schedule in 12 days that cut her overtime costs by nearly a third. I sat with Consula in the break room of Building C and asked her, simply, what she needed, and when she told me, I made sure she got it. You're not what I expected, Patrice told me at the end of my 3rd week, watching me review the following month's staffing sheet at her small office off Cascade Road, 2 miles from the apartment where I'd raised Jordan alone. Most people your age coming into this, they want to be told what to do. You just started running it. I've been running things my whole life, I said. I just hadn't been paid properly for most of it. She laughed, but I watched something calculate behind her eyes, and 3 days later she offered me a percentage stake in the Buckhead contract if I'd help her bid on 2 more properties. She had her I own a senior living facility in East Point and a small chain of urgent care clinics near the airport. It was not, in the language of business, a large offer, but it was the first ownership stake I had held in anything that was not a marriage, a house, or a child, in 52 years of living, and I sat in my car in Patrice's parking lot that afternoon and cried for exactly 4 minutes, not from sadness, but from something with no name I'd learned yet, the particular vertigo of realizing you are not finished becoming a person. Meanwhile, at home, a different accounting was underway, one I did not yet have full visibility into. I learned later, much later, from a vet, who has always had a gift for hearing things through walls that were not meant to carry sound, that Brianna had mentioned to her own mother, at that bridal shower where my folding chairs sat holding up other women's bodies, that Jordan's mother wasn't really around much these past few weeks, and that she found it a little strange, honestly, for someone who's supposedly so devoted to her son. I want you to sit with the shape of that sentence for a moment, because it is a particular kind of cruelty dressed as concern. The suggestion that my sudden, private business was itself evidence of something suspicious, rather than simply evidence that I, too, was a person with hours in her day that did not orbit entirely around my son's household. Brianna's mother, a woman named Patricia Ashford, whom I had met exactly twice, and found perfectly pleasant both times, apparently agreed. Maybe she's got a man, Patricia had reportedly said, to general laughter, as though the idea of Deborah Whitfield having a private life, romantic, professional, or otherwise, were itself the punchline. I did not have a man. I had a spreadsheet, percentage stake in a cleaning contract, and a growing sense that I had been performing a version of devotion for so long that its absence, even briefly, read to the people around me as scandal rather than simply as rest. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next is the part where I stopped explaining myself, and that decision, small as it seemed at the time, would end up costing my son's marriage more than either of them yet understood. Jordan called me on a Sunday in early December, 6 weeks after the kitchen, his voice carrying the particular strained lightness of a man who has been sent to gather information and does not want to admit it. "You've been busy lately," he said. "I have." "Doing what?" I considered, for a moment, telling him everything: the contract, the percentage, consular and the schedule, and the 4 minutes I cried in Patrice's parking lot. And then I considered the ceiling fan, and the 90 seconds of silence in my kitchen that had preceded this sudden parental curiosity about my calendar. And I made a decision that I do not regret, though I understand now it was the moment everything between us truly began to shift its foundation. "I've been building something," I said. "I'll tell you about it when it's ready to be told." "That's it. Building something. That's it, Jordan. Brianna thinks, I don't need to know what Brianna thinks about my Tuesdays," I said, gently, because I did love him, even in that moment, even with the old wound from the kitchen still tender under my ribs. "I spent 28 years accounting for every hour of my life to make sure you never felt the gaps your father left. I don't owe anyone an accounting of my hours anymore, not even you." The silence that followed was long enough that I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its lightness entirely. "You're being weird, Mom. Ever since that thing in the kitchen, you've been, I don't know, different, cold." "I'm not cold, baby," I said. "I'm just no longer available for free." I did not explain what I meant by that. I let him sit with it, the way I had learned to let a difficult diagnosis sit in a room before a family was ready to ask the follow-up questions. And I told him I loved him, and I told him to tell Brianna I hoped the shower planning had gone well. And I hung up the phone in my quiet house on Dello Drive, alone, solvent, and for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure entirely unafraid of what came next. I did not yet know about the life insurance policy Marcus had let lapse 8 years ago without telling anyone, the one that would resurface in February, with consequences none of us saw coming. I did not yet know that Brianna's mother had begun, quietly, to suggest to Jordan that perhaps his mother's newfound independence meant she intended to need less from the family in ways that went beyond folding chairs and Sunday dinners meant, specifically, financially, in a will neither of them had any right to be discussing. I only knew, hanging up that phone, that something in my chest that had been clenched for 6 weeks had finally, quietly, released. The life insurance policy surfaced the way most inconvenient truths do in families like mine, sideways, through a person who had no business knowing about it in the first place. It was my brother Curtis who mentioned it at Christmas dinner, 3 weeks after that phone call with Jordan, in the offhand way men in my family have always discussed Menares, though it were whether unremarkable, safe to bring up over dressing and candied yams. "Marcus ever settle that policy thing with you, Deb?" I set my fork down. "What policy thing?" Curtis looked between me and Yvette, sensing too late that he had walked into a room whose furniture had been rearranged without his knowledge. "The whole life policy, from back when y'all were still married. Sterling mentioned it to me a few months back," said Marcus. "Let it lapse right around the time the divorce finalized. Cashed out most of the value. I figured you knew." I had not known. 9 years married to Marcus Whitfield, 4 more years divorced from him before he passed of a heart attack in a hotel room in Charlotte 2 years ago. And I was only now, over candied yams, learning that a policy he'd taken out when Jordan was 6 years old. A policy I remembered him proudly explaining to me at our kitchen table on Cascade Road, naming Jordan as sole beneficiary, had been cashed out and spent sometime in the murky, humiliating months before our marriage legally ended. "How much are we talking?" Yvette asked in the flat, protective voice she used whenever she suspected someone was about to take advantage of me and needed to establish, immediately, that she would not permit it quietly. "I don't know exact numbers. Sterling just said it was substantial," said Marcus. "Used most of it to cover." Curtis stopped himself, glancing at me, recalibrating. "Look, it doesn't matter now, water under the bridge." But it did matter. And not for the reason Curtis assumed. It mattered because 2 days later, Jordan called Menet about the chairs, this time, not about my sudden mysterious Tuesdays, but about something Brianna's mother had apparently raised at that same bridal shower where the folding chairs had held up other women's gossip. Mom, this is going to sound strange, Jordan said, but did Dad ever have life insurance? Like, a policy with me on it? I felt something cold and familiar settle into my chest, the particular stillness I used to feel on the labor floor when a monitor's rhythm changed in a way that told you, instantly, that the room's easy conversation was about to end. Why are you asking me that, Jordan? Patricia, Brianna's mom, she does some kind of financial planning thing on the side, and she was asking about, family assets, generational stuff, for the whole estate planning conversation Brianna wants us to have before the wedding. And she said something about how sometimes when parents divorce, policies get restructured and nobody tells the kid. And I don't know, it got in my head. I understood, in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost violent in its suddenness, exactly what was happening in my son's household. Brianna's Mothera woman I had met twice, found perfectly pleasant, and now understood with total precision, had begun quietly auditing my family's finances, dressed in the language of generational planning, searching not for my son's well-being, but for the outline of whatever money might still exist to be claimed, inherited, or otherwise folded into her daughter's future. Your father let that policy lapse and cashed it out 14 years ago, I said, keeping my voice level, keeping it clinical, the way I once delivered hard news to families in rooms with too much fluorescent light. I only just learned that myself, 2 days ago, from your Uncle Curtis. There's no policy, Jordan. There's no hidden asset. There's nothing to plan around. Oh, he said, and then, after a pause that told me everything about what conversations had been happening in rooms I wasn't in, Patricia's going to be disappointed. She had this whole thing about setting up a trust structure that would, Jordan. I said his name the way I used to say it when he was young, and I needed him to actually stop and hear me, not simply wait for his turn to keep talking. I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it once, clearly. Brianna's mother is not entitled to an audit of my marriage, my ex-husband's finances, or my estate. If she has questions about generational wealth, she should be asking about her own family's assets, not conducting reconnaissance on mine through my son. It's not reconnaissance, Mom, it's just planning, it's reconnaissance, baby. I've delivered enough babies to enough families to know the difference between someone planning for a future and someone auditing a past for what's left to extract. And I am telling you, as someone who loves you more than I have ever loved anything else in this life, you should be very careful about which one is happening in your house. He was quiet for a long time. You really think Brianna's mom is trying to? I don't know what I think yet, I said, which was almost entirely true. But I know what I heard in my own kitchen 6 weeks ago, and I know what I'm hearing now, and I am asking you to start noticing the pattern instead of asking me to explain it to you piece by piece. Before I tell you what happened at the wedding planning dinner 3 weeks later, because something happened there that none of us saw coming, least of all Brianna, let me know where you're listening from today. Some of you have already lived the version of this where the in-laws start counting what isn't theirs before the ring is even paid off. I did not hear from Jordan again for 11 days after that call, the longest silence between us since I'd started at Patrice's company. When he finally called, it was to invite me to a family dinner the following Friday. His phrase, delivered with a carefulness that told me he had rehearsed it, talk through some wedding logistics at Brianna's parents' house in Stone Mountain. I said yes. I want to be honest about why. Not because I trusted the invitation, but because I had spent 6 weeks building something quietly of my own, and I had reached the point in that building where I no longer needed to avoid a room in order to feel steady inside it. I was not the woman who had stood frozen in her son's kitchen holding a pot of cold stew. I was a woman with a percentage stake in a growing cleaning contract. A woman who had just helped Patrice win the bid on the East Point Senior Facility. A woman who had, the week before, opened a business banking account in her own name for the first time in her 52 years of living. I drove to Stone Mountain that Friday with a different posture than I'd carried into Jordan's kitchen months before. I did not know yet that Patricia Ashford had prepared an entire presentation, an actual folder, printed, tabbed about family financial transparency, that she intended to walk through at that dinner table, with me seated directly across from her, my son on one side and my future daughter-in-law on the other, all 4 of us pretending, for as long as the appetizers lasted, That this was simply a conversation about seating charts and save the dates. The Ashford house in Stone Mountain smelled like candles that had never been lit, the kind of decorative fragrance that exists purely for company. Patricia met me at the door with a smile calibrated precisely for someone she considered beneath serious consideration. And I understood, walking past her into that overly staged living room, that I was not a guest that evening. I was an agenda item. Brianna's father, a quiet man named Reginald who I'd met once before and who spoke, in my limited experience of him, almost exclusively about golf, shook my hand and retreated quickly toward the kitchen, and I noted the way I used to note which family members left a delivery room the moment things turned serious, that he wanted no part of whatever his wife had planned for that evening. We Saturday Jordan would not look at me directly, which told me he already knew what was coming and had decided, again, that his comfort mattered more than my dignity. Brianna sat close to him, her hand on his forearm in a way that read less like affection and more like ownership being asserted for an audience. Patricia waited until the salads had been served before she opened the folder. I wanted to talk a little about family transparency, she said, sliding a printed sheet toward the center of the table, angled eye notice toward me rather than toward her own daughter. As we are building this family, Jordan and Brianna, it's important everyone understands the full financial picture. No surprises, no skeletons. That's how strong families operate. That's an interesting philosophy, I said, coming from someone who apparently ran a full audit on my ex-husband's life insurance policy without asking me directly. Patricia's smile did not move, though something behind her eyes recalibrated, the way Brianna's had in my kitchen months before. I wasn't auditing anyone, Deborah. I was simply helping the kids think about their future holistically. Holistically, I repeated. Is that the word we are using for reconnaissance now? Mom, Jordan said quietly. I'm not being unkind, Jordan. I'm using precise language for what's happening at this table. I turned back to Patricia, keeping my voice at the same even register I'd used for 19 years with families in crisis who needed someone in the room who would not escalate. You want transparency, Patricia? I'll give you some. I raised my son alone on a nurse's salary after his father let a life insurance policy lapse and spent the proceeds without telling either of us. I paid off my house 11 months ago, in full, with money I earned. I hold a percentage stake in a growing commercial contracting business I helped build from nothing over the past 2 months. None of that is your business, and none of it is a resource for you to plan your daughter's future around. The table went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when someone has said a true thing that nobody was prepared to hear stated so plainly. I never said, Patricia started. You didn't have to say it, you printed it. I nodded toward the folder. May I see it? Patricia hesitated a fraction of a second too long before sliding it toward me, and when I opened it, I understood immediately what I was looking at. A projected estate breakdown, my name in a column labeled Jordan's side potential contributions, alongside a modest but specific estimate of my home's equity and a question mark beside a line that read, simply, life insurance, TBD. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. Brianna, I said, turning to my son's fiancée for the first time that evening, did you know your mother prepared this? Brianna's hand tightened slightly on Jordan's arm. It's just planning, Ms. Deborah, every family does this. No, I said, gently, because I did not need to be unkind to be devastating. Every family does not print a spreadsheet estimating the ex-husband's ex-wife's home equity before the wedding invitations go out. Some families simply trust that love will sort out the logistics as they come. I'm curious which kind of family you're hoping to build. Jordan finally looked up. Mom, that's not fair. I keep hearing that phrase from you lately, Jordan. That's not fair. I'd like you to sit with a different question tonight, and I'd like you to sit with it alone, without me answering it for you. Is it fair that you let your mother be described as having nothing left to offer? And then, 4 months later, sat silently while your future mother-in-law printed a folder estimating exactly how much that nothing might actually be worth. Nobody spoke. Reginald, I noticed, had quietly reappeared in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in his hand, watching his wife with an expression I recognized instantly, the look of a man who had been managing this particular storm system for a very long time and had long since stopped trying to redirect it. I stood, folded my napkin, and set it beside my untouched salad. I love my son, I said, to the table generally, though I meant it for Jordan alone. I will always love my son, but I did not spend 28 years building a life of dignity out of very little so that I could spend my 50s being quietly appraised at someone else's dinner table. When you're ready to have an actual conversation about this family, one built on respect rather than accounting, you know where to find me. I left before dessert. I did not slam the door. I did not raise my voice at any point during that entire dinner, a fact I am, to this day, quietly proud of, because I understood even in the heat of it that the moment I became loud was the moment Patricia Ashford would have won the only argument she actually cared about, the one where I could be dismissed as unstable rather than reckoned with as correct. Jordan called me the following morning, his voice raw in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, and had wrecked my old Camry 2 weeks after getting his license. I didn't know she was going to do that, he said. The folder. I swear, Mom, I had no idea. I believe you, I said, and I did. But I need you to understand something, Jordan, and I need you to actually absorb it this time, not just wait for the conversation to be over. Your silence in that kitchen 4 months ago wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern announcing itself. Patricia didn't invent the idea that I'm a line item to be managed. She just found the file Brianna had already started. That's not, he stopped himself this time, before finishing the sentence, and I heard, in that small unfinished silence, the first real evidence that something in my son was beginning, slowly, to see what I had been seeing for months. I'm not asking you to choose between me and her, I said. I'm asking you to notice which one of us has ever once treated you like an asset instead of a son. I did not hear from him again for 19 days. I end that silence. I closed on the East Point contract with Patrice, hired Consula's cousin to help manage the new site, and signed a lease quietly, without telling a single member of my family, in a small commercial unit off Cascade Road that Patrice and I intended to turn into our first shared office space. I did not yet know that Brianna, humiliated by how thoroughly her mother's dinner had backfired, had begun, in the privacy of her own home, to blame not her mother, and not herself, but me for the folder, for the silence, for the growing distance opening between her and the man she was 6 months from marrying. 19 days is a long time to not hear from your only child, and I will not pretend to you that I spent them in perfect, unbothered peace. I am a mother before I am anything else I have built, and there's no percentage stake, no signed lease, no commercial contract large enough to fully quiet the particular ache of wondering whether your son is choosing his silence over his mother. But I had learned, in the months since that kitchen, a discipline I had not fully possessed before, the discipline of allowing an ache to exist without letting it dictate my next move. I filled those 19 days with work, because work, I discovered, was its own kind of prayer. Patrice and I walked the East Point facility together on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, and I found myself explaining to a new hire named Marisol the same thing I used to explain to nervous new nurses on the labor floor, that competence isn't loud, that the people who do the work best are rarely the ones announcing it, that you learn to trust a person by watching what they do when no one important is in the room. I signed the lease on the Cascade Road office on a Thursday, alone, in a lawyer's office 2 blocks from the apartment where I'd raised Jordan by myself on shift differentials, and hoped. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward for a long while, looking at the empty storefront that would soon have my name on the door alongside Patrice's. And I thought about my mother, who had cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and died believing that was simply what women like us did, and I thought about how she would have looked at that lease. And I cried again, the same 4-minute cry I'd had in Patrice's parking lot months before, except this time it lasted 6. Brianna called a vet on day 14 of Jordan's silence. I did not know this at the time. I only learned it later, in the way I learn most things that happen behind my back, through my sister's particular gift for extracting information from people who don't realize they are confessing. She wanted to know if you were talking badly about her to the family, Yvette told me over the phone, not bothering to disguise her contempt for the phrase. I told her the only badly anybody's talked about her is the badly she's earned herself. You didn't need to say that, Yvette. I absolutely needed to say that. A pause, then, gentler. She's scared, Deb. I could hear it. She knows what that dinner looked like. She knows Jordan's been different since. And instead of fixing it, she's out here trying to figure out who to blame that isn't her mother and isn't herself. I understood this instinct better than I wished to. I had watched it for 19 years on the labor floor, the particular human tendency, under pressure, to locate blame anywhere except the place it actually belonged. But understanding a thing does not obligate you to absorb it. And I had absorbed enough on Brianna's behalf already. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her the same thing I'm about to tell you, Yvette said. That the two of you are about to marry into each other's families, whether either one of you fixes this or not. And the longer you both let it fester, the more it's going to cost. But that's her business to handle. And yours to decide how much of yourself you're willing to keep offering to people who've shown you exactly what they think you're worth. Jordan finally called on the 20th day, and when I answered, I could hear, in the particular careful quality of his breathing, that he had rehearsed this conversation more than once before finding the courage to place it. I've been thinking a lot, he said. About what you said, about the pattern. Okay. I talked to Brianna about it, really talked, not just letting it slide the way I usually do. He paused. She said some things that scared me, Mom. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice level. What kind of things? She said maybe we should reconsider some of the wedding planning around family involvement, like, limit how much you're around, going forward, if you're going to keep her word, was undermining Patricia's involvement in our finances. I sat with that for a long moment, in my kitchen, at the table where a pot of oxtail stew had once gone cold, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that the sentence did not devastate me the way it would have 5 months earlier. It clarified something instead. Jordan, I said, I need you to hear the difference between two very different sentences. And I need you to actually sit with the difference this time. One sentence is, my mother and my wife are having conflict, and I need to help them find peace. The other sentence is, my wife wants to limit my mother's presence in my life, because my mother refused to let her family audit mine. Which sentence do you think you just told me? Silence. I'm not going to fight for a smaller and smaller portion of my own son's life, Jordan. I did that with your father for years before I finally understood what it was costing me. I won't do it again. Not even for you. If Brianna needs me to disappear in order to feel secure in her marriage, that's a conversation the two of you need to have honestly, without my mother-in-law printing any folders about it. But I will not shrink myself to make that conversation easier for either of you. So what, you're just done? You're choosing to just walk away from us? No, baby. My voice caught, just slightly, the first real crack in months. I am choosing to stop performing a version of myself that has already been declared worthless in my own kitchen. Those are very different things. And I need you to understand that difference before you get married, because your wife is going to ask you to make this choice again and again for the rest of your life. And I won't always be on the other end of the phone to explain it to you. He was crying by the end of that. Calla could hear it, the particular strangled quiet of a grown man trying not to let his mother hear him cry, and some old, familiar part of me wanted to soften everything I'd just said, to reach through the phone and gather him the way I used to gather him after nightmares in that apartment on Cascade Road. I did not do that. I let the silence hold what it needed to hold, and I told him I loved him, and I hung up. And I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Afterward, testing the new, unfamiliar shape of a boundary I had never once, in 28 years, allowed myself to keep. I did not know yet that 3 weeks later, Brianna would show up at my office on Cascade Road, unannounced, in tears, asking for something I never expected to hear from her, and that what I chose to do with that visit would determine, more than anything Patricia Ashford had printed in her folder, exactly what kind of family we were all about to become. Brianna arrived at my office on a Wednesday afternoon in late January, without calling first, wearing the kind of coat that costs more than my first month's rent used to, and mascara that had clearly given up sometime in the parking lot. I want to tell you honestly what I felt, seeing her through the glass door of the office. Patrice and I had built not triumph, though I understand if you expected that, and not the soft, automatic forgiveness some of you might be hoping I reach for either. What I felt was something Quieter than both. A kind of clinical attention, the same attention I used to bring to a patient whose numbers didn't match her story, yet I let her in. I did not rush to comfort her. I didn't know where else to go, she said, sitting across from my desk, in the chair Patrice usually used for vendor meetings. Jordan's not really talking right now, not really talking at all. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it, though I made no move to fix it for her. My mom's been calling him, telling him things, saying you turned him against the family, that you've been, she stopped, wiped under her eye with a knuckle. She says you've always resented me, that you never wanted him to marry anyone, that you'd rather keep him to yourself forever. I let that sit in the air a moment before I answered, because I have learned that the fastest way to lose an argument is to answer an accusation before you've actually located what's true and what's projection inside it. Brianna, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to actually think before you answer, not just say what's easiest. I folded my hands on the desk. Do you believe that? Genuinely? Or is that your mother's fear, borrowed and repeated so many times it started sounding like your own voice? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved to the window, to the parking lot, to anywhere that wasn't my face. I don't know anymore, she admitted finally. Everything's gotten so tangled. My mom means well, she grew up with nothing, and she spent my whole life terrified I'd end up with a man who couldn't provide, or a family that would drain us instead of build with us. When she saw you weren't around those few weeks, all she could think was that I was hiding something, I finished. Instead of considering that I might simply have been building something. I know that now. I didn't know it then. She looked at me directly for the first time since sitting down. I said something horrible in your kitchen. I've thought about it almost every day since. I told myself I didn't mean it the way it sounded, but I've had months to sit with it. And I think I did mean it. At least a little. I think I was scared of how much space you take up in Jordan's life. And it felt easier to shrink you than to ask myself why that scared me. I studied her for a long moment. I want to tell you that this admission dissolved everything instantly, that I opened my arms, and we cried together, and the story tied itself into the reconciliation you might be hoping for. That is not what happened, because that is not how real dignity repairs itself. Real repair is slower. And it asks more of the person doing the repairing than a single tearful confession in an office chair. Thank you for saying that, I told her. I mean that sincerely, but I need you to understand something, Brianna, and I need you to carry it into whatever you decide to do next with Jordan. I am not a threat to your marriage. I never was. What is a threat to your marriage is a household where your mother audits my finances, where you speak about me as though I'm furniture, and where my son says nothing while it happens. That pattern will keep repeating with or without me in the room, unless the two of you decide, together, what kind of family you actually want to build. What do I do? She asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely young, 28, and frightened and out of her depth in a way her expensive coat couldn't disguise. You start by deciding whether you married my son because you love who he is, or because you needed someone who'd let your mother run the show, and then you have that conversation with him honestly, without me as the referee, because I already spent one marriage being the person who managed everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own peace. I won't do it again. Not even to help you too. She left my office that afternoon without the tidy resolution either of us might have wanted, but with something else instead, the beginning, I think, of an honest reckoning she hadn't previously allowed herself to have. Before we continue, let me know in the comments. Do you think a woman in my position owes her son's new wife forgiveness just because she finally showed up crying? I want to hear where you land on that, because the answer isn't as simple as it looks. 3 days later, Jordan called. His voice was different, steadier, though still carrying the particular rawness of a man who has recently done something difficult. Brianna told me she came to see you, he said. She told me what you said to her. And I think I finally understand something I should have understood in that kitchen 5 months ago. He exhaled slowly. I've spent my whole adult life assuming you'd always just absorb whatever happened around you, Because that's what you always did when Dad was still around. I never once asked myself what it cost you to keep absorbing it. I just assumed that was who you were, not what you were doing. That's a meaningful thing to notice, Jordan. I told Brianna's mom she's not welcome in our financial decisions anymore. That was hard. She's basically raised Brianna to see her as an authority on everything, and taking that away felt like taking away a leg she stood on her whole life. But I told her. He paused. I also told Brianna I need her to actually defend you, out loud, the next time anyone in her family including her says something like what she said in the kitchen, not just privately regret it later. I closed my eyes at my desk, feeling something in my chest loosen that had been clenched, in one form or another, for 5 months. That's what I needed to hear, I said. Not an apology on my behalf. A change in what you're willing to let happen in front of you. I know it doesn't erase it, Jordan said quietly. But I'm trying to actually be the son you raised, instead of the one who was easiest to be. We were not, that afternoon, fully repaired. Some cracks, once they've run deep enough, leave a permanent seam even after the mending. But something real had shifted, something built on more than a single tearful office visit, or a single humbled phone call. And I allowed myself, driving home that evening past the Cascade Road office with my name freshly painted on the glass beside Patrice's, to believe that perhaps my family was finally, slowly, learning the difference between what I would absorb and what I had simply, quietly, stopped offering for free. I did not yet know that the wedding itself, 3 months later, would test every inch of that new boundary, and that Patricia Ashford had one more move left to make before she would finally understand exactly who she'd underestimated. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in April, at a venue in Buckhead not far, coincidentally, from the medical office complex, where my percentage stake had first taken root. I want to tell you that the months between Brianna's office visit and the wedding itself passed easily, that the repair Jordan and I had begun held steady without further incident. Some of it did, some of it did not. Patricia Ashford, stripped of her role as the family's self-appointed financial authority, did not disappear quietly. She redirected. In March, 6 weeks before the wedding, she began a new campaign, not about money this time, but about presence. Specifically, mine.It started small, the way these things always do. A seating chart draft that placed me at a table near the kitchen doors, 3 tables removed from the head table, alongside cousins of Reginald's I had never met. When I mentioned it to Jordan, not as a complaint, simply as an observation, because I had learned by then the value of naming things plainly and letting the other person decide what to do with the naming. He corrected it within the hour, moving me to the family table without argument. Then came the toast. Patricia informed the wedding planner, without consulting Jordan or Brianna directly, that given the family dynamics, perhaps it would be simpler if only Brianna's parents gave toasts, to keep things smooth and avoid any awkwardness. I found out about this from Yvette, who found out from the wedding planner's assistant, who happened to be Yvette's hairdresser's niece. The particular information network that has kept black women informed of what's happening in rooms they weren't invited to since long before any of us were born. I did not call Jordan about it. I had decided, sometime in February, that I would not spend the months leading into my son's wedding functioning as the family's designated conflict monitor, chasing down every small erasure and demanding it be corrected. I had built something of my own. That spring the East Point contract had grown into a third property, a rehabilitation center in College Park, and Patrice and I had begun discussing formalizing our partnership into something with both our names on the paperwork in a way that made it, unmistakably, mine as much as hers. I found that the less I needed my family's validation to feel steady, the less each small slight actually cost me. But Yvette, who has never once in her life let an insult pass unaddressed on my behalf, called Jordan herself. Your future mother-in-law is trying to write your mother out of your own wedding, she told him, with the particular bluntness that has made Yvette both my favorite person alive and the person most likely to start a fight at a family gathering. I don't care whose venue it is or whose money's paying for the flowers. That woman raised you by herself while your daddy cashed out insurance policies behind her back. And she is not sitting at the kids' table like some second cousin twice removed. Jordan called me that evening, apologetic and clearly humiliated at being caught unaware of his own wedding's politics for the second time in 6 months. "I didn't know about the toast thing," he said. "I'm fixing it. You're giving a toast, Mom, and you're at the head table. I should have been paying closer attention." "Thank you for fixing it," I said. "But Jordan, I need you to notice something for yourself this time, without me or your aunt having to point it out. This is the third time in 6 months that Patricia has attempted to reduce me in a room I have every right to occupy fully. That's not an accident. That's a pattern. And the question you need to be asking isn't just how do I fix this one instance, it's why does my wife's family keep treating my mother's presence as something to be managed down?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "it's because you built something none of them can control. Brianna's mom controls everything in her house, Brianna's dad, the wedding planning, even what Brianna thinks about her own worth half the time. You're the first person in this whole equation she can't manage. That scares her more than any folder about life insurance ever could." I sat with that assessment for a long moment, surprised at its precision, and understood that my son slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely had begun to actually see the family he was marrying into with clear eyes instead of convenient ones. The wedding itself, when it finally arrived, was lovely in the way weddings often are when the people at the center of them are, whatever their family's politics, genuinely in love. Brianna looked radiant. Jordan cried during his vows in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. And when it came time for the toasts, I stood at the head table, in a deep emerald dress I had bought with money I earned building something entirely my own, and I looked out at a room that included Patricia Ashford, seated 3 tables back in a seat I strongly suspected she had chosen herself as a small, petty consolation, and I said the truest thing I could find. I raised Jordan alone for most of his childhood, I told the room, my voice steady, and I used to worry, some nights, that I wasn't giving him enough. Not enough father, not enough money, not enough of the things I thought a whole family was supposed to provide. Watching him today, I understand now that what I was actually giving him was something harder to name and, I think, more durable, the ability to recognize real love when it finally showed up, because he'd watched his mother refuse to settle for anything less for herself. "Brianna, welcome to a family that doesn't require you to shrink to belong in it. I hope you'll extend my son the same courtesy." It was not, perhaps, the toast everyone expected, but it was met, when I sat down, with the kind of full-room silence that means something has landed exactly where it needed to, and Yvette, 3 seats down, raised her glass to me with an expression that needed no words at all. I did not yet know, sitting at that head table in my emerald dress, that Patricia Ashford, humiliated publicly for perhaps the first time in her adult life, in a room full of people whose opinion she cared about intensely, would spend the following 6 months attempting one final, more serious maneuver, convincing her daughter, quietly, that the real threat to her marriage stability wasn't her own mother's controlling nature, but the growing, independent, unmanageable success of her mother-in-law. The maneuver, when it came, was slower and more sophisticated than anything Patricia Ashford had attempted before, and I will credit her even now, even knowing everything I know with a certain patience I had not expected from a woman who'd previously shown her hand with a printed folder at a dinner table. It began, as these things so often do, with kindness. In June, 2 months after the wedding, Patricia invited me to lunch. Just the 2 of us, her treat, at a quiet restaurant in Buckhead with cloth napkins and a wine list she clearly wanted me to notice. I accepted, not because I trusted the invitation, but because I had learned, in building a business with Patrice, that you cannot properly assess a threat you refuse to sit across from. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said, almost before the bread arrived. "For the folder, for the seating chart, for all of it. Honestly. I think I let my fear get ahead of my manners." I let her finish. I did not rush to reassure her, the way old habits might have once demanded. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "What changed?" "Watching you at that wedding," she admitted, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. "I've spent my whole life believing that security comes from control of the money, the plans, the people, and I watched you stand up in that room and say something true without a single note of fear in your voice. And I realized I have spent 40 years mistaking control for safety. and they are not the same thing at all. It was, I will admit, a genuinely disarming thing to hear, and some part of me that has always wanted, even after everything, to believe in the possibility of people changing wanted very much to accept it at face value. But 19 years on a labor floor teaches you to watch not just what a person says in a calm room, but what they do the moment the room turns difficult. And I had learned enough about Patricia Ashford by then to keep one hand near the door even while I ate her bread. I appreciate you saying all that, I said. What can I help you with today? Her expression flickered caught, briefly, in the gap between the version of herself she wanted me to see and the version that had actually arranged this lunch. I suppose I deserve that, she said, with something almost like a laugh. Fine. I'll be direct, since apparently that's the language you respect. She set down her glass. I'm worried about Brianna. She's been comparing herself to you constantly since the wedding. Your business, your independence, the way you carry yourself. She feels like she's failing by comparison, like she should be building some empire of her own instead of just settling into married life. And some days I worry the comparison is going to cost her the marriage before it's even had a chance to breathe. I sat with this for a long moment, because unlike the folder, unlike the seating chart, this particular accusation had the uncomfortable shape of something that might contain a real concern buried inside its manipulation. Patricia, I said carefully, are you telling me this because you're genuinely worried about your daughter's well-being, or because you'd prefer I make myself smaller so she has an easier time feeling adequate? Can't it be both? She asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, I heard something that sounded almost like honesty. No, I said. It can't, because if you're genuinely worried about Brianna measuring her worth against mine, the solution isn't for me to build less. The solution is for Brianna to stop measuring her worth against anyone at all, including me, including you, including whatever version of success her sorority sisters are posting online. That's a conversation for you to have with your daughter about her own foundation. It is not a request you get to make of me. Have you ever been asked to shrink so someone else could feel adequate standing next to you? Tell me in the comments, because Patricia's next move, 3 weeks after that lunch, would test exactly how far I was willing to bend, and I promise you, the answer surprised even me. Brianna called me in early July, her voice tight in a way I recognized instantly from that first office visit months before. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest, she said. Are you and Patrice about to expand into the whole Southeast region? Jordan mentioned something about a call you took with an investor. I had, in fact, taken exactly that call 4 days earlier. A regional facilities management group out of Charlotte interested in acquiring a minority stake in Patrice's and my growing portfolio, now spanning 6 properties across Metro Atlanta, in exchange for capital to expand into 3 additional states. It was, without exaggeration, the single largest professional opportunity of my life, arriving 4 months after my son's wedding and 52 years after I'd been told, in my own kitchen, that I had nothing left to offer. Where did you hear that? I asked, curious rather than defensive. Jordan mentioned it. He's really proud of you, actually, but she stopped, and I heard something crack slightly in her voice. I don't know how to feel proud of you and not feel like garbage about myself at the same time, and I don't know how to say that to my own husband without sounding insane. I closed my eyes for a moment, understanding, finally, the actual shape of what had been happening beneath Patricia's manipulations all along. Not a calculated campaign at all, in the end, but a frightened young woman who had never once been taught that another woman's rise did not require her own diminishment, raised by a mother who had built her entire worldview on precisely that scarcity. Brianna, I said, gently, I need you to hear something I wish someone had told me when I was your age. Why building something at 52 doesn't cost you anything. It's not a pie with a fixed number of slices. The version of womanhood where we measure our worth against each other instead of building alongside each other, that's not strength, honey. That's the exact trap your mother has spent her whole life mistaking for wisdom, and I'm asking you not to inherit it. She was quiet for a long time. I don't know how to want things for myself, she admitted finally. I've spent my whole life wanting things my mother approved of. I don't actually know what I'd build if nobody was grading it. Then maybe, I said, that's the actual work in front of you, not comparing yourself to me, finding out what Brianna wants when nobody's grading it. I did not know, hanging up that phone, that this conversation, quiet, honest, entirely unwitnessed by Patricia, would become the actual turning point of the entire year, more consequential than any folder, any seating chart, any toast. I only knew that for the first time since that Sunday in October, Brianna had called me not to defend her mother's fears, but to ask, honestly, for help escaping them. I called Patrice the morning after that conversation with Brianna, and told her I wanted to move forward with the Charlotte Investor Group. She'd been waiting on my answer for 4 days, patient in the way only a woman, who has built something from nothing herself, knows how to be patient with another woman doing the same. You sure? She asked. Minority stake still means giving up control on 3 of the 6 properties. You've read the term sheet. I've read it twice, I said. I want to counter on the valuation, not the structure. We built this. I'm not giving away what we built. I'm pricing it correctly. Patrice laughed, the particular laugh of someone recognizing a version of herself in another person. 19 years running a labor floor, and you out here negotiating like you've done this your whole life. I have, I said. Nobody was just writing it down as business before. We spent the following week preparing a counterpulling 12 months of revenue across all 6 properties, projecting the College Park Rehabilitation Center's growth once its second phase opened, building a valuation that reflected not what the Charlotte Group assumed 2 black women running cleaning contracts might modestly accept, but what the numbers actually supported. I want to tell you plainly that this was, in its own quiet way, the most satisfying work of my professional life, not because of the money, though the money mattered, but because for the first time in 52 years, I was being asked what I thought something was worth, and I was answering with numbers instead of gratitude. Jordan called while I was in the middle of that work, his voice carrying an odd note I hadn't heard from him before, something between pride and disbelief. Brianna told me about your conversation, he said. The one about wanting things nobody's grading. She told you that? She told me a lot of things, actually. She's been different this past week, quieter, but a different kind of quiet. She signed up for a pottery class, of all things, something she said she wanted to try in college, and her mom talked her out of because it wasn't practical. He paused. She cried telling me about it, not because pottery is such a big deal, because she said it was the first thing in years she picked just because she wanted it, without checking if anyone would approve. I felt something warm move through my chest, unexpected and entirely genuine. That's not nothing, Jordan. That's actually enormous. I know. I didn't understand it until she explained it, but I think I finally get what you were trying to tell me back in December. About the difference between what her family taught her love looks like and what it's supposed to actually feel like. And what do you think now? I think, he said slowly, that Patricia's been so scared of losing control over Brianna that she forgot to actually raise a person who could stand on her own. And I think you spent your whole life teaching me the opposite thing. And I was too comfortable to notice until I watched you build something at 52 that nobody handed you and nobody could take away. We talked for a while longer, easily, in a way that reminded me of the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table on Cascade Road doing his homework while I studied for nursing recertification exams, both of us building towards something neither of us could yet name. When we hung up, I sat with my counteroffer documents spread across my desk and allowed myself, for a moment, to simply feel proud not just of the deal taking shape in front of me, but of the son slowly, imperfectly, becoming a man capable of actually seeing the people around him. The Charlotte Group came back within the week, mildly insulted by our counter, which Patrice assured me was the correct reaction to provoke. They expected us to take the first number, she said, reading their response over the phone. They are annoyed because we didn't confirm what they assumed about us. What did they assume? That would be grateful for the attention, Patrice said. Grateful is expensive, Deborah. We stopped being grateful 2 counters ago. We settled, after 3 more weeks of negotiation, on a valuation 22% higher than their opening offer, with Patrice and me retaining majority operational control across all 6 properties, and a capital injection that would fund our expansion into 2 additional states by the following spring. I signed the final paperwork on a Tuesday morning in August in Patrice's office on Cascade Road, and when I stepped outside afterward into the ordinary heat of a Georgia summer, I called no one first. I stood alone in the parking lot for a long moment, the way I imagine my mother might have stood if she'd ever once been handed a moment like this instead of 30 years of other people's flaws. And I let myself simply exist inside the fact of it before I let anyone else's reaction shape how it felt. I did not yet know that within 2 months, Patricia Ashford, watching her daughter grow quietly, steadily independent of her, watching me expand into a business worth more than she had ever built in her own life, would attempt one final, more desperate maneuver, this time aimed not at me directly, but at the marriage itself, in a bid to remain necessary to a daughter who was slowly, finally, learning she didn't need her mother's permission to become someone new. Patricia's final maneuver arrived in October, disguised, as her interventions always were, in the language of concern. It began with a phone call to Jordan, not to Brianna, a calculated choice, I would later understand. Because Patricia had learned by then that Brianna no longer absorbed her mother's fears the way she once had, Jordan told me about it 2 days later, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, in the same chair he'd occupied, as a boy doing homework, looking older than I'd ever quite noticed before. She called me at work, he said. Told me she's worried about Brianna's mental health, said she's been withdrawn, different, not herself, said she thinks it might be depression, and that maybe, he hesitated, choosing his words with visible care, maybe Brianna needs to spend less time comparing herself to people in her life who make her feel small. She meant you, Mom, she was talking about you without saying your name. I felt the old, familiar tightening in my chest, but I noticed, with something like clinical curiosity, how much smaller it felt now than it had a year ago, in that same kitchen, over a pot of oxtail stew, and a sentence about having nothing left to offer. What did you say to her? I asked. I told her Brianna's happier than I've seen her in the 2 years we've been together. I told her the pottery class, and the quiet, and the not checking in before every decision. That's not withdrawal. That's Brianna finally showing up as herself instead of as an extension of her mother's plans for her. He looked at me steadily. I told her if she's genuinely worried about Brianna's mental health, she should ask Brianna directly, instead of calling me to relitigate whether my mother's success is somehow dangerous. How did she take that? Badly, Jordan admitted. She said I've changed, said you've turned me against my own wife's family, said a lot of things, honestly, that I don't think she'd say if she stopped to actually hear herself. I studied my son for a long moment. 29 now, married 18 months, carrying himself with a steadiness I had waited most of his adult life to see fully settle into him. Jordan, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer, not the answer you think I want to hear. Do you believe I've turned you against Brianna's family? No, he said, without hesitation. I believe you refused to let yourself be erased, and everyone around you had to decide whether they respected that or resented it. Patricia resented it. Brianna's still deciding. I've decided. Before I tell you what happened when Brianna finally confronted her mother directly, because something happened in that conversation that changed the entire shape of their relationship. Let me know where you're watching from tonight. Some of you have watched a daughter finally choose herself over her mother's fear, and you know exactly how quiet and how loud that moment can be at the same time. Brianna called me the following week, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in the entire year I'd known her. I confronted her, she said. About the depression thing, about the calls to Jordan, about all of it, actually the folder, the seating chart, the lunch with you where she apologized and then immediately tried to get you to shrink for my sake. How did she respond? She cried, said I was choosing you over her, said after everything she's sacrificed for me, this is how I repay her. Brianna's voice caught, briefly, then steadied again. And I told her for the first time in my entire life, Miss Deborah, I told her that her sacrifices don't obligate me to stay small forever, that she taught me love means control because that's the only love she ever knew how to give. But I don't have to keep inheriting that just because it's familiar. I sat with the weight of what she'd just told me, understanding that I was witnessing something larger than a disagreement between a mother and daughter. I was witnessing the exact moment a young woman decided to break a pattern that had likely traveled through at least 2 generations of women in her family before reaching her. That took real courage, I said. I want you to know I see that. I learned it from watching you, she said quietly. I know that probably sounds strange, given how we started, but watching you refuse to shrink, over and over, for a whole year, it taught me something my mother never could, that the discomfort of disappointing someone is smaller than the cost of disappearing to please them. I did not have a response ready for that, not immediately. I sat in my office on Cascade Road, phone against my ear, and felt something shift permanently between Brianna and Minute friendship. Not yet, perhaps not ever in the uncomplicated way I might have once imagined for a daughter-in-law, but something sturdier and more honest than either of us had believed possible 11 months earlier. Thank you for telling me that, I finally said. And Brianna, for what it's worth, I think the pottery is a wonderful place to start. She laughed, wet and real, through the last of whatever tears the conversation with her mother had left behind. I made a bowl last week. It's lopsided and ugly, and I love it more than almost anything I own. Good, I said. Keep making things nobody's grading. I did not know, hanging up that phone, that Patricia Ashford's isolation from her own daughter would deepen over the following months into something neither of us anticipated, nor did I know that this rupture, entirely of Patricia's own making, would eventually bring her, humbled and alone, back to my office door in a way that would test the very last reserves of grace I had left to offer anyone in that family. Patricia Ashford did not speak to her daughter for 6 weeks after that confrontation. I did not learn the details of that silence directly. Brianna had, by then, stopped rooting her grief through Jordan and had begun, instead, calling me on occasional Sunday evenings, tentative at first, then with the ease of 2 women who had found their way to something neither of us had expected. She's telling people I stole her daughter, Brianna told me in November, during one of those calls, her voice carrying more exhaustion than hurt now. Telling the church ladies, telling her sister, telling anyone who'll listen that Jordan's mother poisoned me against my own family. Does it still sting? I asked. Less than it used to, Brianna admitted. I think that's the strangest part. I keep waiting for it to devastate me the way it would have a year ago. And instead I just feel tired of managing her feelings about my life instead of just living it. I recognized that exhaustion intimately. I had lived inside it myself for the better part of 9 years after my divorce, managing Marcus's version of events to anyone who'd listen, absorbing the quiet implication in certain rooms that I must have done something to deserve a marriage ending. Until one day, I could not name the exact morning it happened, I simply stopped needing anyone's corrected narrative to feel steady in my own life. That tiredness, I told her, is actually the beginning of freedom. It just doesn't announce itself as triumphantly as you'd expect. Jordan and Brianna spent that Thanksgiving at my house on Dello Drive, the first holiday since the wedding that Patricia had not been invited to, not out of malice, but because Brianna had simply, quietly, stopped extending invitations to a woman who used every gathering as an opportunity to relitigate her daughter's choices. I made the oxtail stew again, the same recipe from that first Sunday over a year earlier, and this time Brianna asked to help me make it, standing beside me at my stove, taking notes in her phone, asking real questions about proportions and timing rather than performing curiosity for someone else's benefit. I want to actually learn this, she said. Not because Jordan wants me to know his family's recipes, because I want to know how to make something with my own hands that isn't graded by anyone. Then you're learning it the right way, I said, and handed her the wooden spoon. We ate that Thanksgiving at my table, Jordan, Brianna, Yvette, Curtis and his wife, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, a version of myself that did not feel like she was performing gratitude for a seat she'd earned decades ago. Jordan raised a small, informal toast before we ate, awkward in the way he always was with sincerity. I used to think being a good son meant keeping the peace, he said, looking at me, then at Brianna. This year taught me it actually means telling the truth, even when it costs you something. Mom, thank you for refusing to let me keep choosing easy over honest, Brianna, Thank you for finding the courage to choose yourself. I'm grateful for both of you. And I'm sorry it took me so long to actually earn being grateful for either. It was not an elaborate speech, but it was, I thought, watching my son's face in the candlelight of my dining room, the first time in years I had heard him speak without first calculating whose comfort his words needed to protect. The Charlotte expansion closed formally in December, 6 properties becoming 9 across 3 states, and Patrice and I stood together in our Cascade Road office on the day the final paperwork cleared, looking at a framed photo she'd had made of the two of us at the East Point ribbon cutting 8 months earlier, 2 women in their 40s and 50s. Unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it had cost either of us to arrive there. You know what's funny, Patrice said, studying the photo. A year ago you were a nurse thinking about retirement, now you're a business owner with equity in 4 states. A year ago, I was standing in my son's kitchen being told I had nothing left to offer, I said. Funny how a sentence like that can either break you or become the exact coordinates of everything you build afterward. I drove home that evening past the Dello Drive house I owned outright, past the church, where I still sat some Sundays in a pew that no longer felt like exile, and I thought about Brianna's lopsided pottery bowl, and Jordan's Thanksgiving toast, and the particular ache of a year that had cost me a comfortable illusion about my family in exchange for something far more valuably an honest accounting of exactly who in my life could hold real weight, and who had only ever wanted me light enough to carry without complaint. I did not yet know that Patricia Ashford, isolated now from her only daughter and humiliated by a rupture entirely of her own making, would show up at my office door in February, unannounced, asking not for forgiveness exactly, but for something hardier, way back into a family she had spent a year trying to control instead of simply loving. Patricia Ashford arrived at my office on Cascade Road on a grey Tuesday in February, without an appointment, wearing a coat far more modest than the one she'd worn to that dinner in Stone Mountain 14 months earlier. I saw her through the glass door, before she saw me, and I want to tell you honestly that my first instinct was not triumph. It was recognition, the particular recognition of one woman looking at another, who has finally run out of the illusions that once protected her. I let her in. I did not rush to fill the silence. I know I have no right to be here, she said, sitting in the chair across from my desk, the same chair Brianna had once sat in with mascara running down her face. Brianna hasn't spoken to me in 9 weeks. Jordan's polite to me at gatherings I'm barely invited to anymore. My own husband told me last month that he's tired of watching me lose our daughter over a fight I started and never knew how to end. What do you want from me, Patricia? I don't entirely know, she admitted, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before, not the calculated concern of the folder, not the disarming apology of that lunch, but something closer to actual exhaustion. I think I wanted you to fail. I think some ugly part of me needed you to fail, because if a divorced 52-year-old nurse could build what you've built without anyone's permission, then everything I taught Brianna about needing control to be safe was simply wrong. And I didn't know how to survive being wrong about the one thing I'd built my entire identity around. I sat with that confession for a long moment, because it was, of everything Patricia Ashford had said to me across 14 months of folders and seating charts and disguised concern, the first entirely honest thing. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't clarify a great deal, I said. But I need you to understand something, Patricia, and I need you to actually hear it instead of managing your way around it the way you've managed everything else. I didn't build what I built to prove you wrong. I built it because I was tired of being reduced to what other people believed I had left to offer. Your daughter's growth this year isn't a referendum on your failures as a mother. It's simply her finally becoming a whole person instead of an extension of your fear. I know that now, Patricia said, and for the first time, her voice cracked. I just don't know how to get her back. I don't know how to apologize for a whole way of loving someone. I thought, in that moment, about my own mother, 30 years cleaning other people's houses, who had never once been given the tools to imagine a life beyond what she'd been handed, and I thought about how easily fear disguises itself as protection across generations of women who were never taught any other language for love. You don't get her back by managing your way into her forgiveness, I said. You get her back, if you get her back at all, by actually doing the work of becoming someone whose love doesn't require her obedience. That's not a folder, Patricia. That's years, possibly. And it starts with you actually asking her what she needs, instead of deciding for her what you think that should look like. Patricia left my office that afternoon without resolution, without the tidy reconciliation this moment might have offered in a gentler telling, but with something else, the first honest reckoning of her adult life, arriving 14 months, and one entirely self-inflicted rupture too late to undo the damage, though perhaps, I allowed myself to hope, not too late to begin repairing it. I did not tell Brianna about that visit for several days. When I finally did, over one of our now regular Sunday calls, she was quiet for a long moment. Did she seem sincere? Brianna asked. I think so, I said. But sincerity isn't the same as change, baby. I'd want to see what she actually does differently before I'd trust the words alone. That's a lesson I learned the hard way myself, more than once. I think I want to try, Brianna said finally. Not all at once, not the way she'd want, fast and forgiven and back to how things were, but maybe coffee, just the two of us, no folders, no Jordan as a buffer. See if there's an actual person under all that fear. Or just more fear wearing a different coat. That sounds like exactly the right amount of caution, I said. And Brianna, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you for holding that boundary as long as you needed to before deciding to test the water again. That's not weakness. That's wisdom most people twice your age never learn. Spring arrived, and with it, the particular quiet that follows a year of upheaval finally settling into something resembling peace. Brianna and Patricia met for coffee in March, the first of what would become, over many months, a slow and imperfect rebuilding. Neither of us could fully predict the shape of. I did not ask for details, and Brianna did not offer many, beyond telling me, weeks later, that her mother had cried through most of the first meeting and had, for once, not tried to fix the crying with a plan. She asked me what I needed instead of telling me what she thought I needed, Brianna told me. It's such a small thing. I don't know why it felt like the biggest thing anyone's ever done for me. I understood that feeling more than she knew. I had spent 9 years after my own divorce waiting for someone in my life to ask me that same question, and I had learned, eventually, that the only reliable way to have it answered was to ask it of myself. In April, a year to the week after Jordan's wedding, Patrice and I closed on our 10th property rehabilitation and long-term care facility outside Charlotte, the largest single contract either of us had managed in our careers. We stood together at the ribbon cutting, both of us in tailored suits neither of us could have afforded 18 months earlier, and I thought, watching the small crowd of new employees gathered for the ceremony, about Consula, still with us, now managing an entire regional team, and about Marisol, promoted twice since I'd first watched her work a floor at East Point. Jordan came to that ribbon cutting. He brought Brianna, and quietly, without announcement, standing at the back of the small crowd in a coat that looked considerably more modest than the one she'd worn to that Stone Mountain dinner 2 years before Patricia came too. I did not make a moment of her presence. I simply nodded to her when our eyes met, and she nodded back, and something in that small, wordless exchange contained more honest respect than anything either of us had managed to say directly to the other across 2 years of folders and seating charts, and finally, slowly, humility. You built all this, Jordan said afterward, standing beside me as the small crowd dispersed, looking out at the building that would house, in a matter of weeks, over 200 elderly residents, whose care would run through systems I had designed. From a kitchen conversation that could have broken you. It didn't break me, I said. It clarified me. There's a difference, baby, and I hope you never have to learn it the hard way yourself. But if you do, I hope you remember that the sentence someone uses to diminish you can become, if you let it, the exact coordinates of everything you go on to build. I used to think strength meant not needing anyone, Jordan said, quiet in a way that told me he'd been turning this thought over for a while before finding the courage to say it aloud. Watching you this year, I think I understand it differently now. Strength is knowing exactly what you're worth, and then simply refusing every room that won't honor it when that room is your own son's kitchen. I did not have an immediate answer to that. Only the particular fullness in my chest that comes from watching a child you raised alone finally arrive, in his own time, and by his own reckoning, at a wisdom you spent decades hoping he would find before it cost you too much to learn it. That evening, driving home from Charlotte on I-85, the sun setting somewhere behind me in the direction of the city where I'd built an entire second life out of a single humiliating Sunday, I called Yvette, the way I had called her that very first night, nearly 2 years earlier, driving home with a pot of cold oxtail stew on the passenger seat. "Remember what you asked me that night?" I said. "Whether I had anything left to offer." "I remember," Yvette said. "I also remember you didn't have an answer yet." "I have one now," I said, and felt the truth of it settle into my chest with the particular weight of something earned rather than simply believed. I had everything left to offer. I just hadn't decided yet who deserved to receive it. I want to tell you about an ordinary Saturday morning, nearly 2 years to the day since I stood in my son's kitchen holding a pot of cold oxtail stew, and heard myself described as a woman with nothing left to offer. I woke that morning in my house on Dello Drive, the same house, paid off longer now. The mortgage a memory rather than a monthly ache. I made coffee in the same kitchen, where I'd once sat at 4:30 in the morning typing, starting a small business, after 50 into a search bar with no real conviction it would lead anywhere. I carried that coffee out to the small back patio I'd finally had built the previous fall, the first purely unnecessary thing I'd ever spent money on simply because it made mornings feel like mine, and I sat there in the early light, alone, without a single item on my calendar that belonged to anyone else's expectations of me. This is the ending I promised you at the start of this telling, not fireworks, not a courtroom, not a single dramatic confrontation, where everyone finally says the thing they should have said months earlier. Just a woman, 54 now, drinking coffee on a patio she built with money she earned, in a life she constructed one clear-eyed refusal at a time. Patrice and I now hold ownership across 11 properties in 4 states. A fact I still find myself repeating slowly, privately, the way you test a truth you're not yet fully used to trusting. Consula runs the entire Georgia region. Marisol oversees Charlotte. I go into the office 3 days a week now, not because I need to, but because I've found, at this stage of my life, that building things I actually chose is a different kind of tired than the tired I carried for decades doing what was simply expected of me. Jordan and Brianna are expecting their first child in the fall. Brianna asked me tentatively, a few weeks ago, whether I'd help her think through the nursery, not because she needs my permission or my money, but because she said she wanted her child's first room built by 3 generations of women who'd finally learned to build things without needing anyone's approval to justify the effort. Patricia will be there too, she told me, learning, slowly, imperfectly, what it looks like to love a daughter without needing to control the shape of that love. I do not know yet whether Patricia Ashford's repair will hold across years the way I hope it will. I have learned enough in this life to know that some changes are permanent and others are simply a long, sincere pause before old patterns return under new pressure. But I have decided that watching, patiently, from a place of earned security, costs me far less than it once did to extend people the room to prove themselves either way. As for Jordan, my son, 29 years old now, grey, already claiming more of his temples the way it claimed his father's. I think often about the ceiling fan he found so interesting that Sunday afternoon, and the long, uncomfortable education that followed for both of us. I do not believe he will ever again let a silence like that stand unchallenged in his own home. Some lessons, once truly learned, do not need repeating. I finished my coffee that Saturday morning slowly, in no hurry, the sun climbing fully now over a yard that belonged to no one's expectations but my own. And I thought about the sentence that had once been meant to diminish me, just his divorced mother with nothing left to offer, and I understood, finally and completely, that it had never actually been true. It had simply been unclaimed. Nothing left to offer was never the problem. Nobody had yet asked me, in 52 years of living, what I actually wanted to build. I built it anyway, quietly, without permission. Exactly the way women like me have always had to, and on mornings like this one, coffee going cool in my hands, sun rising over a life entirely my own, I understand now that this was never a story about revenge at all. It was simply the story of a woman who finally stopped waiting to be asked. That's all for today's story. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. If you enjoyed it, Please hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel move closer to our 1 million subscriber milestone.